looking forward to this. We had a great prep call with Jonathan, and he has such awesome experience and point of view through his career at different companies. I'm really looking forward to him sharing that today. So I'll try to do as little talking as possible, but just want to set the stage. Is that I think we're all kind of in this point right now of doing our retrospectives on 2020, personally, professionally, and those experiences, serve as yet another stark reminder that empathy and understanding and collusion, it just can't be taken for granted, that it's something that takes an always on vigilance and effort to make sure that we create a space and an environment where everyone can share and celebrate their individualism, and excited that there are so many brands behind that, and that our general community is so active in doing that. And I think regardless of a company's approach, there are really some just great pillars to make sure that that's happening in your work environment. And a few of those I wanted to share: education. I think everybody needs to continually educate themselves. Celebration, there are so many awesome things about people and companies and communities that need to be celebrated and brought to the forefront. So there's just good awareness, and not kind of in that coastal view. It's not always the way that things are, everywhere in our country and globally. And to make that investment, in time and money and initiatives to celebrate and support those diversity initiatives. And also the last one is just listen, always have an open ear and listen to what everyone in your organization in your life is saying, so we can be, as relevant and timely and as aware, and never be tone deaf to what's happening around us. So just some thoughts to kick off the conversation. And Jonathan, as I said, I'd love for you to do most of the talking today, but would love to just get kind of, your general thoughts and point of view on the topic.
Sure. Yeah. And you hit the nail on the head there. Just making sure that there is that space, so that all of these voices are heard, and we have the appropriate channels internally in all of our respective organizations, is really key to a lot of what we'll be talking about today. Should we go back a bit and do a bit of a quick intro in terms of what we do for our respective organizations? Would that be good?
Yes, I jumped over that and I totally forgot. I just wanted to make sure I share my pronouns of he and him. I thought they were in my name up there, but somehow those fell off.
Oh, yeah.
So I'll let you do your personal intro first.
Technology and pronouns can sometimes be a little bit tricky. I just actually was looking up, apparently for LinkedIn, you can only put like your pronouns on the mobile version, not the desktop. So there's a lot of little nuances like that. Don't worry about it. So John Roman, already introduces Global Director of Marketing Technology Solutions over at EA. Pronouns are he, him, his. And yeah, this is a really exciting conversation to me, just because a lot of times when I do these industry talks, it tends to be more about data and technology, what's the big new thing in innovative technology, things like that. So I think something that's a really big part of my career path now, like in my role in my past, and has been in my past roles, is the component of diversity and inclusion, and then how big of a proponent I am for ERGs. So I think this is a really good conversation that I'm excited about, and to be having this conversation with you, Dan, just because marketing and your ERG environments and how you're creating those spaces, they are intertwined. So yeah, really excited to be here.
Great. So Dan Ackerman, I already shared my pronouns at the trade desk. I lead our North American client development effort. Essentially what that is we work with our biggest partners to really understand their businesses, down to even elements like this, to really understand how technology can help lift up and accelerate their efforts, mostly in the digital marketing and television marketing space. But a deep understanding of the ethos of a company is critical. I think as John alluded to, it just impacts everything: the people you hire, the way you run your business, and then the way your products are developed and brought to market. So I definitely want to spend some time. We will not let you off the hook on talking about technology today, because I would be remiss if I did that. So I think that we had a great conversation the other day. I just thought was super helpful. But just to kind of lay the base, maybe you could talk through some of your professional and personal experiences in how these inclusion efforts really do lay the foundation for how companies operate and be successful, both in the B2C, but also in developing an environment and a company that can really thrive and be successful.
Yeah, I think in this day and age, it's almost like something that's expected from an organization, to have kind of that understanding of the larger world as it appears to not just traditional ways of thinking, and kind of the broader spectrum of humans that exist on this planet, and should be kind of providing those spaces internally in organizations for different groups of people, that have not been, let's say, the front and center of history, or just, that may have a little bit less of that front and center capability to kind of discuss their lives, have that opportunity in that space to kind of discuss and converse, and just kind of just kind of come together as a group to think about some of these challenges that they're experiencing both in and outside of the organization.
Yeah. How does that kind of stand out to you as I mean, you've worked at some really interesting organizations and ones that, are leaders in their space, but as you've moved throughout your career, what are the things that you look for, at every level of the organization to understand their investment and commitment to that kind of thinking?
Yeah, so it's funny, I didn't include that in part of my, I guess, like in my conversations going from different organizations earlier on in my career. There was actually a piece of me that was a little fearful to kind of ask about things like, what spaces do you have for your LGBTQ plus employees and things like that. But as I grew as an individual, that became more and more important to me. And it's gotten to a point where it's like when I'm thinking about, being at any organization, or in some cases partnering with different organizations in the role I facilitate now, those questions do come up, because it's one of those things where it really tells you a lot about an organization and kind of how open they are going to be for you as an individual. If they have at least, at a minimum, something as simple as an ERG set up within the organization to really give those employees that space to be themselves. So
Yeah, and now, I mean, in your role, you're always evaluating partners and how they align with the company, but also align with the company's goals.
yeah.
As you build your teams and you also build partnerships, how has that permeated those discussions? The way you look for people, the way you find talent, whether it be their skill set or their location. Maybe start with that, and we'll kind of go to the partnerships part.
Sure. So, it's really about kind of taking a look at the role at hand. For my team specifically, it's always been about kind of figuring out ways to bring in more diverse talent and more talent that has like differing mindsets, right? I think one thing that's been a little bit of a blessing from a pandemic perspective, right? It's been a really tough time for everybody. But I think from a hiring perspective, it really opened up the doors in terms of one, a lot of us are aware now in specific roles, location isn't that big of an impact. So you have a lot of, I think there was a lot of previous thinking about, you are specifically trying to hire for a certain area. In certain cases, you're like kind of the different types of people you can hire in different areas may be limited just from a geographic perception. And I think at the end of the day, it's given us a broader approach to look all over for all sorts of different types of people, and that includes LGBTQ plus members. I've talked about this in the past a lot, but in certain cases, when you are stuck in that sort of situation where it's like you're tied to a specific geographic location, then it becomes, how do you integrate questions and things within the interview process to gauge somebody's willingness to work in an open and inclusive environment, and how they're going to contribute to that, right? So it's like, you start integrating questions maybe into the interview process of candidates and saying, what has been your past experience in an ERG within your organization? Or tell me a little bit about, something you've done that wasn't just, your 9-to-5 work expectation. How did you contribute to the organization in a larger way? And that really gives you that kind of insight of, okay, I couldn't maybe in this specific situation for whatever reason get a super diverse hire, but you are also not bringing in people into the organization that are a detriment to that.
Right.
You really want to bring in those folk that are, they want to make the organization more inclusive. They want to make it better. And for me, that's become a red flag over the years. If you are kind of talking to somebody or a candidate or in a partnership where there seems to be pushback against that sort of mentality, it could be, a little bit challenging to move forward with that relationship.
Yeah, it's a great point. It's not just about making investment in hiring and building up the diversity of your organization, but also hiring in groups that don't necessarily contribute to diversity, but that person and their approach supports and can also move the ball forward for expanding diversity without necessarily being part of one of those groups that add to the diversity. Great point. And just curious, as you not only kind of building up the organization at EA, you're a very acquisitive company in terms of game studios and new businesses, but also you have a huge partner ecosystem. It's necessary to be able to operate a global business, and especially in kind of pushing forward the innovation in digital marketing, technology, measurement. Does this permeate at all, that partnerships part of your role?
Yeah, I think it's kind of funny to think about like the RFI process and how we kind of assess different vendors in the space. Now it's almost become, it's one of those things where you also want to take a look at how that company is represented to, the general public, right? And a lot of that and a lot of bad things can stem from any sort of notions of your company being exclusionary or not
Yeah.
being diverse enough or not being queer friendly. There are just so many things that, outside of the technical components of a solution that you're trying to bring on, especially when you're thinking about an organization, a global organization like EA, you go into the light of what will the perception be of this organization based off of some of those partnerships and how, those people are perceived. So I think it's definitely there. It's definitely something we think about. And then the overall comfort of folk internally that may be working with different members of those different organizations, right? We always want to make sure they feel safe, they feel comfortable, they can be their true and authentic selves, which you hear a lot about these days in terms of these conversations, especially how it comes top down from leadership. Like you want to bring your true and authentic self to work. And there's, that goes sometimes beyond the organization itself. It's also partnerships. It's also where you're conducting business, things like that, that can attribute to the comfort of your own employees internally. So
That's right. Yeah, and I think it speaks to that broader of like, if it's part of your kind of foundational principles, then it organically will permeate everything. The way you interact with your consumer, the way you interact with your partners, and in an area that you may think totally unrelated to another part of your business, like evaluating partners. That kind of reminds me of one of the topics that we talked about in the lead up was that kind of foundational alignment on this being really important and how it touches so many parts of the business.
Yeah.
And of course, we're brand innovators, so we got to talk about marketing related elements of that. So, in the way that, products are developed and the consideration of the diversity of the end consumer, and also maybe we'll start there and then also talk about how that impacts the way those products and services are marketed to consumers.
Yeah, it's funny because I think when I first heard the title of this conversation, my mind immediately went to what LGBTQ plus specific campaigns have we launched and like how are those? But I think you really thinking through that, it's not even about your marketing tactics specifically to those communities. In my mind, the best thing an organization can do, and this isn't always, you can't always do this in every organization. I had a funny thought earlier where I was like, you can't make an Oreo. I think Mondelez was one of the speakers earlier. You can't make a queer Oreo. And then I thought about the Lady Gaga Oreos that just came out. You can make a queer Oreo. And I have way too many packets of those right over there. But yeah, for EA specifically, we're building content, right? Like we are a form of entertainment, something that goes beyond even the television and film industry because it's way more interactive. You're putting yourself in the shoes of a specific character and kind of ingraining yourself into a world that's been built up, whether that be a fantasy-based world or a world that is a reflection more of our real life that we're living now. So you want to make sure that, as real life reflects, all sorts of different people and all sorts of different mentalities are reflected in your product when you have that chance to do so. Because, and I think this was even mentioned a little bit from Emily about the white masculine gay perspective, but I'll take it a step further. There's a large conversation about gaming where it's like the white male protagonist has been done so many times, right? There are a lot of audiences are looking to find themselves in these characters in these games and find representation in themselves in these games because they want to be fully immersed and engrossed. And I love to think about The Sims as a really good example just of, this is a game that's essentially built around you creating this alternative life for yourself and creating, in some cases, it could be a character that's completely different than who you are, but in some cases, you may want to create a character that's a pure reflection of who you are in reality in this like digital space. So the people who are playing these games, and this goes for other sorts of entertainment as well, they should have the ability to be reflected, not only just reflected in those games, but also in a way that's authentic. And that really comes from those specific people contributing to the development and the creation of these products themselves. You know, not just somebody, it's not necessarily enough, I think, anymore to just be like, oh, we threw in representation in here. It's more about how is that organically infused into the products that you're putting out in the world.
Yeah, which is, you know, a long-term commitment because games definitely do not get developed overnight. You know, each version of them takes, you know, millions of people hours to develop those. So if it's not important from the beginning, it's not like you can just drop that in, you know, right before the game gets released. And how have you seen that, you know, come out? So that's really kind of the company and the game studio. And then, you know, their partners in marketing then need to bring that to consumers in events, in digital marketing and offline marketing. How have you seen that been done well, where that then, you know, kind of threads all the way to kind of the final mile of touching the consumer?
Yeah, you'll find a lot of times this happens just through word of mouth and different like kind of reviews of games and things like that. Public sentiment is actually really huge. So if we take like a pure play marketing perspective, if the product is built in a genuine and authentic way that includes a lot of these things, you know, it doesn't feel forced, it feels like it's organically embedded into the content, you'll have a lot of word of mouth. You'll have a lot of people that, again, they're looking, because you sometimes don't get a lot of these opportunities. They're looking for these sort of games to play in their day-to-day life. And if they love it, and if they feel like they're represented, and if they're having a really great time, they'll vocalize it, right? Like they'll talk about it. They'll post it on forums. Things like Reddit, you know, are becoming bigger and bigger to gauge public sentiment for certain things.
Yeah.
And it's a great medium to say, you know, when we've done something wrong. I think this goes for any organizations as well. Everybody makes mistakes, right? It's really about using that sort of sentiment and creating those spaces and understanding where you can get that authentic feedback to do better in the future. And to your point earlier, the one great thing about games, sometimes it's a good thing, sometimes it's not a great thing, is that you do have the ability now, you know, back in the day, if you bought a game for Super Nintendo, that was the game in its final format. There was no ability to make any adjustments, you know. And then, you know, now you do have, to a degree, if you think of games as a service, if you think of it as a living and breathing product, there are ways to ingrain specific pieces of content to celebrate, you know, different parts of the year, whether it be Pride Month, where it be, you know, kind of a Trans Day of Visibility, things like that. So there are these opportunities to kind of ingrain that into the product itself on an ongoing basis. And then if, you know, somebody messed up, somebody made a mistake, somebody was just unaware of, maybe they released a specific piece of content that in their eyes, it did not seem offensive or upsetting, but to somebody else's eyes outside of their own, it did. You now have the ability to take those things out of these games and continuously improve. So I think one thing EA does really, really well is just gauging that sentiment and then taking some of those kind of recommendations to heart and then kind of pushing those out in a future state if it hasn't been hit like right off the bat, which is something I really like to do.
Well, I think you've opened the door for a technology conversation now. So really two things I want to dig into is, you know, one is the investment in technology to create that feedback loop. So it's not, you know, kind of trolling the message boards and communities to find negative or positive, but there is, you know, create data inflow. So you can be aware of those things, whether it's a fix in the game or, you know, things. What have you done or have you seen done well to create that feedback loop?
It's funny because you think about the amount of data we have access to in the world right now, right? And to your point, there is so much, like you have, you know, thousands and thousands and thousands of responses and message boards and conversations happening all at once. So this is where kind of the perception of, I think, outside of the LGBTQ space in general, this is also something that kind of plays into the larger thought of data sciences and like data scraping and how you're finding kind of meaningful conversations taking place that could influence the marketing or the actual product itself but you need a really robust marketing sciences or a data science team to kind of go through and vet all of that information, because there's so much of it.
Yeah.
So it's really about like working with those teams to really figure out how you can get that public sentiment ingrained. What is the responses? What is the feedback? Both over the internet or the digital space as a whole, but then through direct pathing, that you're providing those spaces directly to your consumers to say, hey, here's a survey feedback. You've purchased our game. What do you think about it? Here's some feedback, right? And then to figure out where you're seeing the most things mentioned that have the biggest impact to make those sort of changes, either for that gaming title itself or from a future state perspective of anything else that's done. So yeah. Data aggregation, data collection. Of course, we want to stay in a CCPA and a GDPR compliant way, and any other data privacy. That's very, very important. We never want to be intrusive, but giving that space and making sure that the consumers also understand how that data is being leveraged is extremely important. But it does come for the greater good, especially when there's something that's been done wrong.
Yeah, I don't think there's enough talk about the responsible and valuable use of data. I think a lot of people just get caught up in kind of the nefarious bad players and a lot of the regulation that's addressing that. So that's helpful. And not every organization has as direct a connection to consumers as you do. So if it's a kind of CPG and others, they may be more tangentially connected. So you sit in a great place with that direct relationship. Another angle on the data is, there's so much talk about that in the digital marketing space, about the value of first party and data and second and third and all those data signals to focus and make the experience better for the consumer, especially if they're a prospect, they're not already an EA customer. But that can be challenging. There can be accidental mistakes made in the usage of data. And how have you guided your teams in looking at that? Because we're all focused on acquisition and lifetime value, but also using that data in a way that people may not think about it from like their day-to-day kind of perspective.
Yeah, this is good, going back to what we kind of touched upon earlier, which is about, it's not always just about the data you're collecting inherent and how you're leveraging that data, but then also some of the data that's coming from your third-party partnerships. So we talked a little bit about this on our last, on our kind of warm-up chat the other day, but understanding certain providers, social media providers, there have been stories, and luckily these things have changed, but in the past, of maybe data being used in a way that has outed certain people, right? Like you hear these stories of people that were targeted by interest-based advertising on Facebook, let's say, because they were targeted to a specific degree, which you can't do anymore, which is great, but and they were being essentially outed because of the things that they were getting targeted with from an advertising perspective. So I think it helps, and this is where it becomes really, really helpful to go back to who are the people in your organization leading these conversations about data use and the appropriate use of data, both from a legal perspective, both from a technical perspective, but then from a, I guess you could say like an emotional or public responsibility perspective. And that's why we come back to the whole conversation about diverse and inclusive hiring. Those perspectives, as you're kind of hiring in a specific way to make sure that you do have a diverse amount of people from all sorts of different backgrounds, all sorts of different sexualities, races, and things like that, because they'll be able to contribute and they'll be able to catch these little things that you may not be able to if you don't sit within those specific groups. So the legal component, the best practices component, the technical component, sometimes it's not enough, right? You also need to have those other voices in the room, especially when you're thinking about personalization. That's a big area. You want to be real careful about, one, does your user want to be personally targeted, right? You want to make sure they have a clear understanding and the ability to either opt in or opt out, depending on the scenario, of how they want to be targeted and how they want their data to be leveraged. And then there's also this kind of notion of just tonality, just making sure in general, you have somebody kind of double checking your work. If you are targeting a specific group and you don't come from that background, you want to make sure you have the right internal, I almost want to say like, not a use case group, but the internal sentiment provided, whether it be through an ERG, whether it be organically through people you're hiring that are sitting on these marketing teams and these data-driven teams, to call some of these things out inherently and raise these questions.
Yeah, it's I think it shines the light on that marriage between human and machine.
Yeah.
That is always it needs to be an intimate relationship. We can lean heavier and heavier and heavier on machines. It's the human element that helps to guide that as well, which is important. I do just want to call out for everyone joining us. We're going to move to Q&A in a few minutes, and just like to make sure that we take advantage of John's time and his knowledge, and make sure we get some good questions going there. So I did want to, as we start to wrap up here, one of the things that's interesting is as you move through your career and move into more prominent positions with more responsibility and larger teams, that element of mentorship and guidance in your org and people that are coming in becomes that much more important. What have you done, and what's worked for you in terms of helping to guide people that are newer, earlier in their career, and folks that are coming in, so you can share the knowledge, but also all of the bumps and bruises and scrapes that you got along the way, and getting to where you are, and learning how to do this the right way.
Yeah, I think something, just to bring it back to like kind of the LGBTQ plus component as well, because I
Yeah.
definitely want to put a focus on that.
Sorry, that's what I meant.
Yeah. Getting involved in things that are outside of just your 9 to 5, right? So like I have a role here at EA. It has a specific function behind it. One thing that's not mandatory of me specifically is to be closely aligned or part of these ERGs. I just enjoy it, and I think it's a great way to take a look at people across the entirety of the organization, and to really find those people that want your feedback and want your sort of guidance throughout the organization, whether they're on your team directly or not. I think there have been a number of instances where people have reached out using that forum to ask me general questions about career pathing, have used it as an opportunity to get to know my side of the business a little bit better, and they may come from a drastically different side of the business. Is huge, and that's one of the big challenges of working in such a large like global organization, is like you could literally go through the entire span of your career without having met certain people or teams, just because they don't interact with what you do on a day-to-day. So I think just being more heavily involved and actually sitting on the ERG board at EA has been an amazing experience, and I've started kind of incorporating it into anywhere I go. So outside of just asking about it during the interview process, I like to get involved directly, and then that also becomes a really good forum, tying back to the marketing piece, where you could also, that learning goes both ways, right? Like I am not a representative of the entire LGBTQ plus community. I have my own subsidiaries and like the things that I've experienced inherently. But these groups are just full of so many diverse opinions and kind of thoughts. They are a great place to, if you're on the marketing side and you're worried about, and not just the Pride ERG that I sit on here, but we have other ERGs, like we have Aspire, which is primarily for Asian Pacific kind of employees, and then Beat, which is predominantly for our Black employees. It's a great place that if you're worried about the tonality or something that you're putting out into the world, and you want a forum to put that past a group of people that will be upfront and tell you, what their thoughts and opinions are on that. It's an amazing space to do that. And I think, you may not have those resources sitting directly on your team. Go to your ERG, ask those questions. Don't be afraid. And another thing I want to point out about the ERGs, I think sometimes, there's a misperception that ERGs are only made for those groups specifically. But I'm here to tell you there are certain places and times that are meant for specific groups of people to have, sensitive conversations in their own space. The ERG environment should be open to everybody that's, supportive of these groups, to join, to listen in, to become a better ally, to become more knowledgeable from a work perspective too, like especially if you sit in the marketing realm, to understand how these different groups function. So I cannot stress kind of the importance and the value of setting up these internal ERGs enough. There's so much value that's brought in from setting up these groups internally.
Yeah, that's helpful and great perspective. So we're going to take some questions down, and we have one which is awesome because it all grounds us in the fact that we mostly work for profit organizations and need to be focused on developing things that are good for our employees, good for people, but also contribute to the growth and health of the business. Do you have, this is from Andrew, is a specific example of where your work and being an inclusive marketer have been really good for business? I mean, in general, of course it is, but, examples of how you've gotten ahead, taken market share, created positive momentum for the business.
Yeah, it's really about going back to kind of the content that's being generated and the content that's being made. You don't have to worry about specific targeted marketing as much if your product is inherently made in a way that is going to attract these consumers to be a part of these experiences. So I think just the general kind of inclusion that's been more and more embedded into games, and the conversations that have been had about, hey, let's stop during development, let's take a look about our diverse representation in this game, and not just making a character and then like throwing it in a space, but then also making sure that the talent you're hiring, from a voice acting perspective, even that could be super important. If you're depicting a trans character in a game, hire a trans voice actor, because those people, there are actors that need work, and it's great to have somebody that's actually representing the character that's being portrayed on screen. So I think try not to go too off topic, because I know the initial, what was the initial like ask again there?
It's like, a good specific example of how it's been like good for business and really made.
Yeah. So to tie that all back up, it's like you're opening up the doors for all these people to really kind of be interested in your games or your products, depending on how you're marketing or how you're building it into the product itself. You're naturally going to get people that are interested in being part of those experiences when they feel like they're represented in the product itself. So yeah, I would say that's good on its own, right? Like and then understanding, I think one thing that's really important, going back to the public sentiment piece, is understanding when somebody who's being inflammatory or angry in the reverse. I'm a huge gamer outside of work, so you get a lot of these notions of like, why are we being forced to take in the gay agenda in our gaming? And it's like, well, nobody's being forced. It's just, this is a real life representation of how the world works. There are all sorts of so many different people, and people just want to be represented in these games and these experiences. So I guess to sum it up, it's like, make sure it's organically kind of embedded in the product when you can. Do it in a way that's authentic and true, and the users will come. And again, it cycles back to that word of mouth. There are people looking for these sort of experiences because they're rare. If you look at the entire gamut of queer-centric games in general, like, there's a lot more content coming out these days. I think as we're in the world, as the world is opening up more and it's becoming, less of a, almost like an expectation for organizations to be aware of the larger LGBTQ plus community and their employees. But it's still a generally small amount of the totality of the space of games that exists in this day and age. So that's what I can say for that.
That's helpful. Yeah, I mean, you are a gamer by personal preference, and now you're one of the largest companies building the most interesting games. But you have worked outside of gaming. When you look at the kind of broad spectrum of marketers that we experience messages all day, and I know the last panel talked about this, but what has stood out to you as either great creative, great campaigns, or just really well done approaches to appealing to the LGBTQ plus community?
Yeah, I think there's really, so I'll go back to my agency side days, because you were managing a lot more brands at once. So I've been a part of several organizational kind of Pride Month campaigns. There have been some really good ones, and then there's been some that felt a little forced. So I think it's like one of those things of figuring out, what truly makes a great campaign is authenticity. And I think that's often lost if you have a team developing this sort of creative or these adverts that aren't from these backgrounds. They're more trying to figure out on their own how to depict, a sort of message that they think will resonate with a separate audience that they have no direct insight into. So that's where you want to make sure you have the adequate voices in the room to really gauge that. I've also seen the other side of things where it's like tone deaf, right? There was no kind of there was no inclusion of getting somebody's perspective before these adverts went out in certain cases. And there wound up being a big backlash by the community for insensitivity or just a misconception of things that are really important to some of these community subsets. So again, like, bring them in from internally in the organization. If you don't have them at all, for whatever reason, you don't have an ERG or you don't have anybody internally or a nice subset of people to give you that kind of that feedback, seek it externally. Just make sure you're doing it in some way, shape, or form, because the worst thing that can happen is you're just tone deaf. You think your marketing is well-intentioned and it winds up backfiring, right? And then you have people that are like, I'm done with this organization or their business because of that. So it's hard to get and it's hard to get those customers back. You know, it's really hard to get those customers back once they feel like, you know, they are not represented by the organization or the product, or the company doesn't have their best interests at heart. So
yeah, that's great. And another kind of follow-up question to that, you know, you're expected to have the right tonality and to have good creative and during tent poles like Pride Month. But what advice would you give to making that, you know, the other 11 months of the year, doing that in a responsible way and doing it in a way that builds that authenticity with that community?
Yeah, I would say the opposite, right? So making sure that your general advertising isn't specifically catered to a specific group of people, making sure that the general representation in your advertising is diverse, and you can do that in a way that doesn't seem forced. The forcedness is a big thing for me, because I feel like consumers are getting more and more smart and immediately spotting out when something feels like inauthentic or forced. So I think just think about, you know, the general creative and the messaging you're putting out into the world. Try to think of ways and brainstorm how you can make it more inherently inclusive. Not to say it needs to cater or pander to any sort of group or anything like that, but just like organically, like, who are you hiring on your teams to make these decisions? What are the ideas that you're thinking about that aren't just coming from one point of view, but rather a diverse point of view? So I would say, like, you know, if I use something like The Sims as an example or something like that, show every part of the year, show that there is a total kind of spectrum of things that you can do within this game that hit on a number of different subsets of people. Just communicate to your audiences that you have the capacity to kind of build this true version of yourself in a way that's just representative of the game itself. So
I know we're about to get the hook, but I do have one last question for you. What are you most excited about and you know, have the most positivity of going into this year of, you know, these kinds of initiatives, but more generally inclusiveness, you know, taking another step in 2021?
Yeah, you mean like from a business perspective, or?
Yeah, from a business perspective. I mean, whether it's in your own organization or, you know, more broadly and you know, as a community of marketers.
Yeah, I think this has been a great year. And I think, again, Emily talked a little bit about it. I was only able to catch the tail end, but I think I heard a little bit about this. It's just, this year has been so good. It's been such a terrible, like 2020, I'll say in general, has been such a terrible year for everybody. But I think there was a lot of learning and a lot of things that came to light. And this goes into other communities outside of the LGBTQ plus community, but there's a lot of intersection as well. So I think this started a great amount of momentum. Both from a hiring perspective, where can we hire individuals? Is working in specific geographic areas as important as maybe people thought it was in the past? And that being kind of a way that we can diversify talent more and more. You know, it never stops. You want to make sure that's a continuous thing within an organization. And then I think just the momentum of the conversations have created a lot of great spaces, you know, both in EA and in other organizations, that I'm hoping everybody internally is putting the fuel to keep these things going, you know, into the new year, past the new year, forever forward, and just this continuous growth. That's what I'm looking forward to. I'm seeing it now, and I want to make sure that, you know, these things continue.
Awesome. Well, John, thank you so much. Andrew and the BI community, the Trade Desk is excited and thrilled to be part of this dialogue and part of this event and others on this topic. So thanks so much for everyone that tuned in. Appreciate the time and looking forward to seeing you again soon.
Well, right back at you, Dan. Thank you so much for that fantastic discussion. John, real quick, before we let you go, you know, we've been asking all our speakers today, with Pride Month looking likely to be in yet another virtual celebration.
Yeah.
Well, how are you guys thinking about it? Do you have any initial concepts in mind on what that might look like for EA?
So Got it. Oh no, yeah, that's a fun question. Our focus right now is more on the Trans Day of Visibility that's coming up at the end of the month. So we have started talking about Pride though, and we haven't necessarily netted out what we're doing for Pride yet, but we do know 2020 was what we're calling the year of the drag queen. We had so many drag queen focused events at EA to celebrate Pride Month. What we do know for this upcoming Pride season is that we want to move a little bit. We love our drag queens, but we want to move a little bit away from pure drag queen and get a little bit more of diverse talent and kind of those sort of forms of entertainment and conversations happening for this Pride. So that's where our mind is right now. But yeah, it's a continuous conversation. Just less drag queens, less drag queens.
Yes. Okay. Well, I think as we've learned today, it's all about the healthy mix, the intersectionality of drag and other parts of the LGBT spectrum. Absolutely.
Right. Exactly.
Awesome. Well, again, John and Dan, thank you so much for that fantastic discussion. All right, so we have 2 more sessions left for you this afternoon, and I want to tee up this next one. We're so excited to welcome Brent